The Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels is unquestionably one of the all-time greatest performers in the history of professional wrestling. In the mid-90s, as Michaels reached his 30s, one could easily make the case that he was the best wrestler to have not yet held a world title. That would change come WrestleMania 12 in 1996, as that was the intended day of Michaels' coronation as the WWF's top guy. Though the talented and charismatic Michaels had gained a reputation for being a major headache behind the scenes, most would concur that he was exceedingly worthy of holding the big belt. But perhaps it's fitting that the vehicle through which Michaels captured his first ever world title proved to be just as polarizing as the man himself. This is Behind the Match. These days, WWE creative at times can feel very haphazard. Plans change has become a sardonic buzz phrase as angles get dropped, pushes go by the wayside, and week-to-week continuity demonstrates a lack of long-term planning. Or at least it feels that way. In the summer of 1995, however, Vince McMahon decided that Michaels was going to be the one standing tall at the end of WrestleMania 12 in 1996, the WWF Championship fastened around his waist. A full 8 months in advance, and perhaps even longer, the plan was set in stone. Bret the Hitman Hart remembers fielding a call from McMahon that August, where his boss laid out some important developments. The first was that Diesel's one-year reign as WWF champion was coming to an end at that November's Survivor Series, and Hart would be the one to unseat Big Daddy Cool. In the same conversation, Hart learned that he was ultimately going to be a transitional champion, couriering the belt to Michaels in Anaheim on March 31st. When McMahon asked Hart if he had any issues losing to Michaels, Hart admitted that he gave it some thought. Though a good portion of the locker room had grown weary of Michaels' behavior and cited political maneuverings, Hart had no reservations about putting Shawn over. As Bret wrote, "Despite how the boys felt about him, Shawn was a hard worker and had paid his dues as far as I could see. Of course I had no problem with it." Hart did, however, feel that while Michaels deserved a run as champion, it wasn't going to magically make things right with the WWF. "I didn't mind putting Shawn over at WrestleMania 12, but I knew Shawn wasn't the guy to fill my shoes, and I was damn sure he wouldn't draw any better than I did." Hart also noted that while he personally showed respect to his peers in the locker room, trying to do right by everyone regardless of their spot on the card, Michaels treated a lot of the wrestlers like they weren't good enough to work with him. With this duality of Shawn Michaels, the brilliance could be potent enough to offset any unpleasantries. As a performer, Michaels was everything the marketing and objective critiques made him out to be. Over the preceding few years, Michaels filled his match portfolio with genuine classics. From two very different ladder matches with Razor Ramon, to a heated Intercontinental title match against Jeff Jarrett, to a Royal Rumble match laden with one rotten gimmick after another, with Michaels playing ring general for the match's entire duration. When Raw was exceptionally bad at the turn of 1995, there was Michaels serving as regular guest commentator, echoing lots of audience sentiment by mocking the hokey in-ring proceedings. That may sound a little insubordinate on his part, but the truth was that Michaels was usually the best parts of those shows. He was so lively, so charismatic, so refreshing that he outshined this tepid new generation fare, simply by firing off a couple of zingers from the company's TV studio. Though a heel at the time, it was going to be hard to keep Michaels heel for much longer. He radiated coolness, and audiences caught on to his dynamic talents more than ever. Entertaining in every conceivable way, Michaels felt like the star of the show whenever he appeared. He could outshine anyone else by working harder than them, and he could do it while barely lifting a finger. A face turn right after WrestleMania 11 was an easy sell to the WWF audience. Though the top babyface tier was pretty overcrowded in this period, Michaels had the most total upside. Crowds loved him, and he could deliver mightily in the ring and on the mic. Plus, he wouldn't turn 30 until July of 1995, so time looked to be on HBK's side as well. With all this in mind, it's little wonder why Vince McMahon began planning Michaels' title win upwards of 3 seasons in advance. It did say a lot that McMahon chose Hart to be the one to put Michaels over at WrestleMania 12. At a surface level, it sounds like McMahon wanted to put on the best possible main event from a quality standpoint, since few in the company or North American wrestling in general could lace either man's boots at the time. Putting Hart against Michaels is putting together a surefire match of the year candidate. And while that's plausible, it can just as easily be argued that McMahon had few other real options for a main event. He could have had Diesel lose the title to Shawn at WrestleMania, but instead made the decision to have him drop it to Hart before then. Whether it's because he'd already run Diesel versus Shawn at Mania once, or because Diesel's reign wasn't setting the business on fire, whatever the case, Kevin Nash was not going into WrestleMania with the belt. The heel side of the roster was especially anemic. Owen Hart and Yokozuna were reasonable candidates, but they'd been anchoring the mid-card as tag champs since April. That left choices such as Psycho Sid, King Mabel, and... well, that's about it really. The buy rate for WrestleMania 11 with Diesel as champion and Lawrence Taylor as a special attraction was down 19% from the previous year's event, and business wasn't exactly heating up in the summer. Outside of The Undertaker and Bret, there were no other old reliables to run with as champion heading into WrestleMania. Needing the right guy to lose to Michaels on the big stage, Hart made the most sense, especially given the type of match that Michaels would be winning the title in. From the mind of Booker Pat Patterson came the idea to have Hart wrestle Michaels in a 60-minute Iron Man match. In the eyes of an old-school guy like Patterson, the two had what it took to tear the house down in an epic-length showcase. But Patterson also noted that McMahon wasn't too keen on running that sort of match due to the length. After all, it's not like a Royal Rumble match where one's attention span is sated by a new entrant hitting the ring every few minutes. For this, it would be just 2 men going wire to wire without any smoke or mirrors. The longest WrestleMania match to date was the double title match between Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 6, and that clocked in at just below 23 minutes, so an Iron Man match was asking a lot. Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer noted the risks of running the match, writing, "With expectations put at such a high level, if the two come through, it'll be a match remembered for years. But if they slip up just a tad, and going 1 hour with today's style of wrestling is asking a lot from both men, it'll be considered a disappointment." Nonetheless, Patterson managed to sell McMahon on the idea. The match would determine the best wrestler, extra emphasis put on that word there, in the World Wrestling Federation. Running Hart versus Michaels for an hour did have one subjective benefit though. The roster was so bereft of established WrestleMania-worthy stars at that point that devoting a large chunk of time to only one match ensured that mostly the top guys would populate the card. Indeed, only 6 matches took place on the pay-per-view itself, the lowest for any WrestleMania to date. And it was a WrestleMania of mixed messages. The pre-show featured the payoff to months of tedious Huckster versus Nacho Man skits, the ones in which the WWF roasted 2 aging stars that were now collecting a check from Ted Turner. That payoff? Well, Huckster, Nacho Man, and billionaire Ted all dropped dead of heart attacks. Of course, that ageist humor didn't contrast so well with WrestleMania matches where the Ultimate Warrior and Rowdy Roddy Piper humiliated 2 heels in their 20s, leading one to wonder what was so new about this new generation. But at least Michaels was young and vibrant. The main event angle was all about the boyhood dream of Michaels as he looked to make good on a childhood goal of becoming a wrestling world champion. There were the expected obstacles like falling short to Diesel at WrestleMania 11, staving off possible retirement due to injury via the unprecedented Owen Hart concussion angle, and then beating the odds to win his second Royal Rumble in 1996. By the time Michaels came out of the February In Your House match, in which he defeated Owen to retain his championship match, it was clear that WWF was going all the way with HBK. By contrast, WWF champion Hart was booked as a lucky survivor in title defenses against Undertaker and Diesel in his last 2 pay-per-view outings, and pretty much played second fiddle to the grudge between the 2 monsters. Hart and Michaels were presented on pretty equal footing when the Iron Man stipulation was announced by interim President Piper on the February 26th episode of Raw. If the WWF was going to pull off an Iron Man match in a WrestleMania main event, the two best men for the job were lined up to give it a go. But could they pull it off? Endurance was going to be an issue, even for two well-conditioned wrestlers like the champion and challenger. Michaels remembers Hart devising a simple system whereby the two could simply communicate their in-match comfort levels by saying a number to the other. Anything below a 5 meant that they were feeling good, something like an 8 meant that they needed to slow down. If they said 10, then grab a hold and regroup. For the match to be successful, they needed to enthrall the audience while also being frugal with their stamina. As for the contents of the match, how does one fill 60 minutes of match time? There's so much that has to go into such an important encounter, one with high expectations to boot. Somewhat incredibly, Hart claims that the two didn't start putting the pieces of the match together until the early afternoon of WrestleMania Sunday. They sat down to go over things, dividing the match up. Shawn would come up with the first 25 minutes while Hart devised the next 30 minutes. Then Shawn would do the final 5. They then sat for over 3 hours polishing the plan until they both knew it all by heart. Hart also suggested that neither man score a fall during the 60-minute duration, which Michaels agreed to, reasoning that if they were the top guys, they should be difficult to beat as opposed to catching multiple falls on each other. This would lead to an overtime period where Michaels would quickly fell the champ and culminate the dream. In an important detail, Hart also suggested that after the match, he wouldn't publicly endorse Michaels, instead displaying frustration over the manner in which he lost. Hart was taking a long hiatus from wrestling after the event, and the idea was to use his post-match actions as a way to build an inevitable rematch. The first act of the intended arc occurred at an event that drew nearly 19,000 fans to the Arrowhead Pond in Anaheim. After the Warrior squashed the future COO in under 100 seconds, Steve Austin picked up his first WrestleMania win, and Diesel became the 5th victim of the streak. All eyes turned to the grand finale. Michaels entered first, preceded by trainer and mentor Jose Lothario. Added into the angle to create something akin to a Rocky and Mick dynamic, Lothario ended up being a mostly background player, as his understated demeanor didn't mesh well on camera with Michaels' frontline flamboyance. And flamboyant Michaels' entrance was. Lothario entered the ring and pointed up past the sightlines of many. And then, from high above the capacity crowd, there Michaels stood, gyrating within a zip-lining harness. Seconds later, he took off from his sky-level base, rappelling down over the heads of thousands of astonished fans. It's an all-time WrestleMania entrance, but understandably a rather risky one. One test run with the zipline was actually performed by Vince himself earlier that day, which just makes one sad that he didn't enter into his match with Shawn at WrestleMania 22 in that same fashion. Hart entered second in his usual straightforward fashion, spelling out the difference in philosophies and mindsets between the two stars. After referee Earl Hebner explained the rules, the match was off. And so were many of the fans. It was reported that many in the crowd began leaving during the early stages of the WWF title match, with the Wrestling Observer estimating a few thousand empty seats. This has been attributed to a number of largely casual fans who'd gotten their fill of the WrestleMania experience, chiefly the comeback match of Warriors, and they weren't sticking around for an hour-long match. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 or 16,000 fans remained for the torch-passing encounter, which Hart and Michaels began slowly enough. In fact, much of the early going was comprised of groundwork and submissions. The action didn't spike until deeper into the first half of the match, where Michaels went to superkick Bret on the floor, only to strike timekeeper Tony Chimel when Hart moved. By the midway point, the collective realization was that there probably wasn't going to be many falls in the match, and so fans began loudly booing false finishes. Perhaps fans would have taken more interest if they knew that there was a little genuine hostility playing out inside the ring. At points, Hart claims that Michaels subtly began working snug with him, leading to Bret responding in kind. At one juncture, Hart said that Michaels had inadvertently bitten his own tongue during a German suplex and took his frustration out on Hart by subsequently punching him hard in the abdomen. The stiffer punches continued rolling in until Hart fired back with a genuine boot to Michaels' face. Though all of this sounds like it works to the match's detriment, the truth is that Hart and Michaels, when they weren't subtly trying to loosen the other guy's teeth, executed everything beautifully. The match was extremely technically sound, it's just that it was a little more no frills than fans might have cared for. Things picked up in the last half hour of the match, where the Iron Man challenge started feeling more like the match of the year candidate that it was intended to be. The bumps became more dramatic, the near falls more elaborate, and the sense of urgency more palpable. With 5 minutes left, Hart handed the match calling over to Michaels, who had a gem of a final sequence in mind. Fighting like hell to score even one fall on the reigning champion, Michaels threw everything he had at the Hitman to no avail. Then, selling every accumulated ache, Michaels ascended the turnbuckle in search of the answer. Leaping off with a missile dropkick, Michaels' feet were snatched out of the air by Hart, who twisted the challenger into his sharpshooter. Michaels flailed desperately as the 30 seconds left on the clock were made to feel like 30 agonizing minutes. It was the same manner in which Michaels lost to Hart in a world title match at the 1992 Survivor Series. Now a babyface with a sympathetic story, Michaels correctly guessed that the fans would frantically count down as the arena clock hit 0. Time had expired. Per the plan, Hart went to leave with the belt, believing that a tie goes to the champion. And that is when Howard Finkel announced a sudden death period, to which Hart feigned annoyance. The new period lasted less than 2 minutes. Hart worked over Michaels' ailing back, but the challenger managed to slip out of a cross-corner attack. And that's when Hart turned and ate one super kick. After an excruciatingly dramatic double down, both men dragged themselves to their feet, where Michaels delivered a second sweet chin music, which was enough to realize that fabled boyhood dream. One little note from the post-match has come up over the years, as Bret wrote in his 2007 memoirs that when the celebration began, Shawn frustratedly told referee Earl Hebner, "Tell him to get the out of the ring, this is my moment." Though Hart expressed annoyance at Michaels' alleged remark when he first wrote about it, he later softened his take, saying, "Sometimes those things are said for the purpose of speed, and they don't quite come out right," referring to Michaels needing to be the sole focus as the pay-per-view went off the air. As for the match, it was the right result, but was the path to the finish line the correct one? Dave Meltzer awarded the match a rating of 4.25 stars, calling it excellent, but noted that it was nowhere near where a match of its importance, placement, and promotional hype needed to reach. Others have come to similar conclusions. Hart and Michaels may have worked masterfully within the framework of what they were tasked with, but it was hardly the masterpiece one would expect from the two men. A normal match with no running clock may have yielded a WrestleMania all-timer, especially a 30-minute match comprised of the Iron Man's last half hour. The consensus seems to be that the Iron Man match is a flawed classic. Two top pros demonstrating why they're top pros, but not exactly a match you look forward to watching a second time. The match also didn't prove to be much of a draw. At 290,000 buys, WrestleMania 12 not only fell from the previous year, but it was the least bought WrestleMania dating back to WrestleMania 2, and that was back when pay-per-view was less widely available. But the performers were proud. Hart called the match probably the greatest match I ever had, or close anyway. Michaels felt a sense of completion over earning the championship, writing, "I thought to myself, if it's all over tomorrow, it doesn't matter. I've gone to the top." From a technical and physical standpoint, it's fair to say that the match may have been each man's most impressive work. But on the subject of working, neither man was done working just yet. Post-match, rumours emerged of heat existing between Hart and Michaels, stemming from Bret not endorsing Shawn in the ring after the match. When Bret hastily left the building in his car that night, many of the boys believed that the two were on bad terms, whether it was due to Bret allegedly refusing to lose within the designated hour, or over the missed handshake. The truth is, Hart and Michaels concocted the undercurrent of resentment as a way to ensure a little spark when they revisited their feud many months from then. If rumours of heat between them made it to the dirt sheets, that would only make their eventual rematches all the more intriguing. Bret recalls brother Owen calling him the next day from Raw, telling him that a lot of the wrestlers believed there was genuine friction between he and the new champion. This pleased Bret, who was willing to let the tension simmer while he took his in-ring hiatus. But manufactured tension would eventually give way to legitimate animosity by the time the two had another pay-per-view match with each other. And if one rest hold after another isn't your thing, believe me, there's nothing at all boring about the story that comes next.